Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about a Stefan Molyneux video, The Truth About the Native American Genocide, which is just one in a series of videos that covers history, pop culture, public figures, you name it. And let's start off by watching just a short clip from the introduction to this particular video.
Hi everybody, this is Stefan Molyneux from Freedomain Radio. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're as sick and tired as I am of being lied to about everything all the time. Your history is lied about in order to control your future. I'm sick and tired of it, and I'm going to help you break out of the matrix of Marxist delusions that have birthed our self-destructive modern culture. So,
quite an intro there. And this is what I find interesting about Stefan's The Truth About series. He openly starts off with the assumption that the established and accepted history is a lie. The description to his video reads, "Interactions between the early European settlers and America's native population are often described using terms such as slaughter, genocide, and Holocaust. But what is the truth about the Native American genocide?" With the implication being that apparently terms like slaughter, genocide, and Holocaust could not possibly be the truth. You see, for Stefan, there was the actual true historical event, and then that truth was perverted and warped by liberal, leftist, white guilt, Marxist professor types in order to control society or whatever it is they do. And then after that comes Stefan, who's going to see through their lies and their ideology, re-establish the truth and thereby save the world or something. Now, just to lay all my cards on the table at the start here, I don't agree with Stefan there, you might be surprised to hear. For me, it goes, there was an actual historical event, let's say the violence against the various Native American peoples by white people invading their lands. Then there were proposed justifications for that behaviour in an attempt to absolve the white folk of any guilt in the situation. Then after that came the book-learning professor types who, through historical research and actually, interviewing Native American people and asking them about it, uncovered the truth of the situation. For white people, of course, the native people already knew the truth of the situation. Then comes Stefan, who is fed up not with being lied to, but that the truth is now being told because it's a truth he doesn't want to hear. So he dismisses the modern historical consensus as a lie and tries to get us back to this point when white people were good and absolved of any wrongdoing ever. And wouldn't that be nice? So which of us is correct there? Well, to find out, we're going to take a look at Stefan's video. That the established history is a lie is a pretty big claim and would require a lot of proof. So we're going to see what Stefan has to offer on that front. And as always, except for the times when I forget to say this, I recommend that you also watch his video so that you can be sure I'm not misrepresenting it. I'll put a link in the description below. So okay, welcome back, quotes, and let's start off by giving a brief overview of Stefan's video. Firstly, in the section titled Estimates, Stefan lays out his best guess for the native population decline in numbers. Then in the section titled Declines, he argues that since there are more native people alive today than at his lowest estimate around 1880, that a genocide could therefore not have occurred. Next, in the sections titled Disease, Empty, and Effects of Disease, he makes the case that a genocide could not have occurred because the majority of Native American deaths were attributable to disease and starvation. Then in the sections titled Warfare and Alliances, he lists some native violence against the white population and makes the case that any white violence was justified by the fact they were at war with the natives. So a genocide could not have occurred because the actions of any white people were, quote, in conformity with the laws of war that were accepted at the time. Now, you may have noticed there that Stefan's video is primarily concerned with whether or not what happens to the Native Americans can technically be called genocide. And there is much academic debate on that subject, most of it boiling down to what particular definition of genocide one happens to be using. Now, personally, I think it's something of a goalpost shift. Stefan is hiding from the actual interesting question, which is, was what happened to the Native Americans right or wrong? By instead having the dictionary definition argument, as if by potentially proving that what happened to the Native Americans could not technically be called genocide, it was therefore somehow justifiable. Now, there's obviously a lot of moral ground between justifiable action and outright genocide. of course, but Stefan's video is about the genocide question, so that's what we're going to be attempting to answer too. So then, was what happened to the Native Americans a genocide? And there are three main points Stefan makes when answering this question. He says no genocide could have occurred because not all native people were killed, most deaths were due to disease or starvation, and white violence against the natives was justified by the rules of warfare. And we're going to go through these one by one in more detail. But first off, we're going to read the legal definition of genocide from the UN, so we know exactly what we're looking for. Genocide is defined in Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide 1948 as, quote, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So, commit all that to memory, folks. And okay, with that very lengthy introduction out of the way, let's get to Stefan's arguments. Firstly, the fact that not all native people were killed.
Now, in 2014, those who directly self-report as Native Americans number just under 3 million people. So, over a few hundred years, the European control of North America has increased Native American genetic expression enormously. Diluted, no question, but it has increased. That is not technically or even allegorically genocide in any way, shape. Genocide is when the gene pool gets wiped out, not when it flourishes.
So here, Stefan is making the case that there are about 3 million self-identified Native Americans in the US today, as well as a varying amount of natives contained within other racial populations, whatever that's supposed to mean. And he declares that a genocide could not have happened, otherwise neither of these things would be the case. And there's a few problems with that argument. The first is that just because there are still Native Americans around today doesn't necessarily mean a genocide could not have happened in the past. The legal definition of genocide accounts for acts committed with intent to destroy a people in whole or in part. Not every single Native American person would have to have been killed for it to count as a genocide. As a comparison, in the year 1900, there were around an estimated 11 million Jewish people living in the world. Today, there are more than 14 million. The number of Jewish people alive has increased over the last 100 years. Does that mean that there could not have been a genocide committed against Jewish people sometime in between those two dates? Are we therefore to conclude the Holocaust could not have happened simply because it did not kill every single Jewish person? Of course not, that's ridiculous. And Stefan is talking about a history that is several centuries long. You can't just look at the starting population number and the ending population number and conclude entirely from that no genocide happened between those two times. The next problem here is that Stefan is only considering race and genetics. The legal definition of genocide also accounts for attempts to destroy national, ethnical, and religious groups. An important thing to remember here is that Native Americans were not a single monolithic group. There were many, many different groups of people living under the umbrella term Native American. An attempt to destroy any particular one of these groups could be classified as genocidal in and of itself, without necessarily having to include wiping out everyone else of that racial group. The Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, which we'll talk about later, just to pick one example, was undoubtedly a singular genocidal act, even though the aim was only to kill the Native Americans present, rather than all Native Americans everywhere. So I'm forced to conclude that these numbers are, to quote Stefan, not an argument, since with regards to our genocide question, it doesn't matter how many Native Americans there were before colonization or how many Native American people there are today. Those numbers by themselves cannot tell us anything about whether a genocide was committed in the interim. Anyway, let's move on and talk about disease and starvation, and we'll tackle the most contentious issue first, which is the alleged use of smallpox blankets to deliberately infect the native population.
So, deliberate infection from smallpox blankets. Well, these are based entirely on 2 letters from British soldiers in 1763. Not a government program, not a government policy, no evidence that it was actually done. Now, in 1763, this is long after smallpox had actually peaked, and there's no evidence of a significant outbreak as a result of this vaguely theoretical bioweapon.
So first off here, where Stefan says the stories of deliberate infection are based entirely on 2 letters from British soldiers in 1763, that's a lie, unfortunately. We do have a series of letters sent between General Jeffrey Amherst and one of his colonels discussing a plan to deliberately spread smallpox with infected blankets during the siege of Fort Pitt in 1763, during which Amherst states, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race." Extirpate meaning to exterminate there. So there's no doubt what their intent was here. Now, Stefan claims the stories of deliberate infection stem entirely from these letters, with there being no evidence such a thing was actually done. However, over here in reality, we also have the journal of Merchant and Militia Commander William Trent, who was at Fort Pitt, and he writes of a parley with the besieging native people. Out of our regard to them being the natives there, we gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect. And we even have the army invoice for the blankets and handkerchief, quote, taken from the people in the hospital to convey the smallpox to the Indians. Now, either everyone in Fort Pitt decided to play a bit of a practical joke on later historians, or actually, their letters and records describe them doing a thing that they actually did. And Stefan is elsewhere happy to accept letters from the time as being truthful. In the section of his video titled Empty, he quotes something a John Winthrop wrote without once noting that, of course, this is just one letter, it's not necessarily truthful, etc., because that letter was saying something he thinks bolsters his argument. When the letters say something he doesn't like, though, oh well, they're just letters, not actual evidence. And one wonders what actual evidence Stefan is waiting for, really, from Fort Pitt in 1763. Video footage, perhaps. Who knows? Now, the effects of the deliberate infection attempt at Fort Pitt are, of course, impossible to ascertain. Any outbreak of smallpox after the blanket incident could have been unconnected to it. Also impossible to ascertain is the frequency of this tactic, though. I'd personally say that the fact multiple people all spoke about the plan without commenting on its unusualness or immorality suggests it was a tactic that was at least known about beforehand, even if it wasn't necessarily widely practiced. However, with regards to our genocide question, the efficacy of the blanket tactic doesn't actually matter. The legal definition of genocide states any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy. Intent. They intentionally tried to spread disease in order to, as General Amherst openly stated, exterminate a race. It doesn't matter how well it worked. They don't get let off the hook for being bad at genocide. What matters is that they tried to do it. Let's move on and discuss the unintentional deaths by disease and its effects.
If you are infected with a disease, you don't even know it. No one tells you about it. There's no symptoms. Nobody knows what's going on. And you go and hug some family member and unknowingly, unwittingly infect that family member with your disease. We would consider that a terrible tragedy. We would not charge you with murder. Come on. I mean, this is not that morally complicated.
Not that morally complicated, eh? Well, we'll see about that. Stefan's little analogy there is pretty telling. Throughout the sections of his video entitled Disease, Empty and Effects of Disease, he repeatedly stresses the completely innocent and unintentional way in which Native Americans contracted and died from various diseases. After all, we can hardly blame the white settlers for the diseases they passed on unintentionally, can we? Things aren't that simple, unfortunately. There's several factors that Stefan fails to either notice or mention here. He treats every death from disease or its effects as a completely blameless accident. And to examine this, we'll again use a comparison to the genocide carried out by Nazi Germany. Many of the deaths in German concentration camps during the Second World War were due to disease. And many of these could also be called unintentional. In one sense, it wasn't as if the Nazis were deliberately infecting each and every individual prisoner who died of disease. Rather, the terrible conditions under which the Nazis forced their prisoners to exist facilitated the easy spread of disease. Malnourishment, close confinement, overwork, stress, denial of proper healthcare, all these things can help disease to spread. Now, the Nazis are, of course, still at fault for those deaths, even though it was technically the disease and not them that did the killing. My point here being that, of course, not all disease deaths are blameless, even if the disease itself wasn't intentionally passed on. So how applicable is this comparison to the treatment of Native Americans? Could the actions of the white invaders have contributed to the spread of disease, even unintentionally? And to start to answer this, let's watch two little clips of Stefan here. First up, from his section titled Effects of Disease.
And it wasn't just the direct effects of the disease. Right, so often so many adult natives were incapacitated by disease that the others, like the pregnant women, the children who relied on their food gathering, died from starvation. Sometimes as many died from hunger as died from disease.
So Stefan is right there. Often it wasn't the disease that killed directly, it just made it harder to hunt or gather food, which then led to starvation. And this relationship also goes the other way. Malnourished bodies are less likely to fight off disease and infection, and therefore lack of food facilitated the spread of disease. And now let's watch the second clip from his segment entitled Alliances.
Now, whites who were unable to beat the natives on the plains would wait till they went to ground for the winter and then would destroy the food stores during the winter. And this was, in fact, the impetus for the initial reservation system.
Whites destroyed native food stores during winter. Now, I trust most of you will have got the point already right now, but just to make it clear, actions of the white European Americans, such as burning the natives' food stores, helped disease to spread. And as such, we can't designate all the deaths from disease or starvation as blameless, as many of them may not have happened if it were not for the additional actions of the white people. Now, destruction of material resources is one such action that would encourage the spread of disease, but others include the forced removal of native people from their lands. For example, many of the deaths associated with the Trail of Tears were due to disease or starvation, the rounding up of native people into internment camps, and so on. These actions all helped disease to spread. And I'd again like to make something clear here that Stefan doesn't mention, whether deliberately or not. The period of time he's talking about, from when the first Europeans encountered Native American people to the present day, is several centuries long. Not all disease deaths occurred at the initial moment of contact, and often it was only later, once the native peoples had been weakened, impoverished, and rounded up into internment camps, that epidemic diseases had the opportunity to spread. In fact, not all disease deaths were even due to new diseases brought by the Europeans, but rather existing diseases that the actions of the European Americans had made more dangerous. Stefan's metaphor, in which one unintentionally gives someone else a disease which kills them, with a hug of all things, is not really the most apt here. A better metaphor would be one person imprisoning and starving another person until they're so weak their body can no longer fight off disease. And should that person then die of a disease, how responsible would we say the imprisoner is? Now, to be fair here, my metaphor there involves one person breaking the law, and Stefan has claimed that whatever violent acts were committed against the Native Americans, such as burning their food stores, were justified by the laws of war that were accepted at the time. So if that were true, my metaphor would also be a bad one. So is Stefan right there? We're now going to take a look at the sections of his video where he discusses and attempts to justify the intentional violence inflicted upon the Native Americans. Is it true that it was always justified by warfare? Well, let's see. And, of course, there are many different massacres and atrocities I could point to and tell you about here where white people slaughtered defenseless, peaceful native people and destroyed their homes. But I'll just do one. The one I mentioned earlier. Let's talk about the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. So way back in 1851, 13 years before the massacre, the United States and several Native American tribes signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, in which the United States recognized large amounts of land as native territory, which they held no claim over. This included parts of modern-day Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, and Kansas, so not exactly an insignificant amount of land there. However, 7 years later, in 1858, gold was discovered in Colorado, triggering the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, and that meant that a large amount of European American settlers started violating the treaty and illegally moving into and settling on native land. Stefan at one point mentions a similar series of events in California, stating, "The discovery of gold in California exacerbated tensions." Now, what exacerbated tensions means is triggered a genocide of the native population in what's known to history as the California Genocide. And even by the most conservative possible definition of the word genocide, what happened in California undoubtedly qualifies. Militia groups waged a war of extermination against the native people, often with implicit and sometimes even explicit support from both the state and federal governments. In 1851, California Governor John McDougall announced his intent to make war upon the Indians, which must of necessity be one of extermination to many of the tribes. And if that's not outright genocidal intent, I don't know what is. So that's your exacerbated tensions there. What a wonderfully cowardly revisionist fig leaf that phrase is. Tom broke into Bill's house, murdered his family, and stole all of his possessions, and that really exacerbated tensions between the two. Anyway, so back to the Pikes Peak Gold Rush in 1858. After the discovery of gold in Colorado, there was a flood of European American settlers illegally crossing into native lands and exacerbating tensions all over the place. Now, in an attempt to keep the peace, a designation of chiefs from both the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes signed the Treaty of Fort Wise, ceding to the United States most of the lands they currently held claim to. This new territory was less than 1/13 the size of the land claimed by them in the Treaty of Fort Laramie a decade earlier, so they forked over the vast majority of their lands in order to keep the peace with the states. Among the Cheyenne chiefs who signed the treaty were Black Kettle, White Antelope, and Lean Bear, and they're important, so remember those names. Sorry, I realise there's a lot of dry history recitation in this section, but I promise it's all important for fully realising just how incredibly fucked the Sand Creek Massacre was. So, 3 years later, 1864, the year of the massacre, Colorado troops under the command of US Army Colonel John Chivington began, without any declaration of war, mind, or real reason apparently, attacking and destroying Cheyenne camps. And on May 16th, 1864, a detachment of these soldiers encountered a group of Native Americans in a buffalo hunting camp. This group included Black Kettle and Lean Bear, two of the chiefs who had 3 years ago signed the Treaty of Fort Wise with the United States. Lean Bear rode out to meet the soldiers, fully confident of a peaceful encounter. You see, Lean Bear had previously met with President Lincoln in the White House and carried with him documents signed by Lincoln explaining he was a friend of the United States and was peaceful. As he approached the soldiers, they opened fire and murdered him. They were acting on orders from Chivington to kill every Cheyenne they encountered, and to quote the man himself, "I have come to kill Indians, and believe it's right and honourable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little, nits make lice." Pleasant chap there. Anyway, tensions now very exacerbated. The governor of Colorado, John Evans, sent a letter to the various local tribes, inviting all who desired peace to report to Fort Lyon, where they would be recognized as peaceful and placed under the protection of the United States government. Black Kettle then led a group of his people to Fort Lyon, where they were directed to settle at Sand Creek. In the center of the camp, over his lodge, Black Kettle flew an American flag with a white flag tied beneath it to signal they were peaceful and under the protection of the United States. The majority of people present at the camp were women and children, as most of the warriors were away hunting. So let's just recap how these people got here. 2 times they had signed treaties with the United States, and 2 times people from the United States had violated those treaties, invaded their lands, and killed their people. The natives had signed away most of their remaining lands, attempting to keep the peace with the United States. Lean Bear, one of their chiefs, was murdered in cold blood attempting to keep peace with the United States. And now finally they had surrendered themselves to the mercy of the United States, settled where they were told to, and were fully under the impression that they were at peace and had been guaranteed protection and safety. Now, content warning for this next bit. I'm about to read some pretty nasty stuff. If you're bothered by descriptions of violence, I'd skip ahead a little ways. So okay, on November 29th, 1864, Colonel Chivington had a detachment of his men surround the camp at Sand Creek with guns and ordered them to open fire. The women and children in the camp gathered around the American flag above Black Kettle's lodge. White Antelope, one of the chiefs I mentioned earlier, was shot down as he approached the troops, shouting for them to stop firing. His body was later mutilated. He was scalped and had his nose, ears, and genitals cut off. The soldiers then moved into the camp with rifles and sabres and massacred everyone they could. Witness accounts speak of scalped children, children with their brains knocked out, pregnant women being cut open, children being used as target practice by the soldiers, mutilated corpses, all manner of dreadful things like that. More than 100 people were murdered at Sand Creek, the majority women and children, and all of them peaceful. Black Kettle, the chief, managed to escape the camp and somehow remained dedicated to achieving a lasting peace, right up until 1868 when he was shot in the back and killed by US Army soldiers when he was crossing a river. Chivington, the colonel who orchestrated the massacre, never faced criminal charges. So what does this guy have to say about Sand Creek, or indeed any massacre or atrocity carried out against the Native Americans? Well, absolutely nothing. Stefan deals with the issue by just not mentioning it at all, besides one passing reference to there being examples of cruelty on both sides. There's no mention of Wounded Knee, or Sand Creek, or any other atrocity. In fact, actually, in a video entitled The Truth About the Native American Genocide, Stefan never once names or quotes a Native American person. Does that seem odd to you? Because it should. How can a video profess to tell the truth about history while completely ignoring one side of the history? Stefan only talks about white violence against the natives when he thinks he can justify it. And let's have a listen to him attempt to do that.
Now, say what you like, if these actions were almost certainly in conformity with the laws of the war that were accepted at the time. The villages of warring natives who refused to surrender were viewed as legitimate military targets and could be acted against, and this of course occurred significantly later when Churchill bombed the Germans and so on. So, like it or not, those are part of the rules of war at the time and considerably thereafter.
So, Stefan's argument is weak here, of course, because there is no good argument in defense of what he's trying to defend. He compares the destruction of Native American food stores and villages to the Allied bombing of German cities in World War II, which is a bit silly for several reasons. Firstly, that Allied bombing of German cities is actually a rather contentious issue, but regardless of that, whatever your opinion of Churchill or the actions of the Allied forces, they were at the very least fighting against an expansionist, genocidal, fascist state that would have invaded and conquered their countries if it had the opportunity. The white people in America were fighting against some native people whose land they wanted to steal. And Stefan's metaphor further casts the Native Americans as the Nazis, which, piss off. The other way Stefan's argument is weak here is that throughout this section he mentions several instances of native violence against white people. And he's saying, this is what was normal at the time. You can't blame anyone in particular for that. It wasn't just the white people doing the violence. Mum, they did it too. It's a childish argument of moral equivalence there. And I thought it was the leftist Marxist professor types who went in for all that stuff, not you, Stefan. Anyway, attempting to equate the violence of the natives with the violence of the European Americans is wrong for a few reasons. Mainly, obviously, the scale. The whites had cannons and rifles and organised military. They had a much greater ability to inflict violence. But even if we ignore that material inequality and we give native people all the same equipment and assume an equal number of people killed on each side,
One side was still fighting to defend their lands from invasion, and the other side was the one doing the invading. The native people always come out morally superior if that's how we're measuring it. The other odd thing about Stefan's argument here is that he, in his introduction, mentions the superiority of white Western civilization. That is, of course, what he's trying to preserve and defend, the idea that white Western European people are superior, though I'm sure he wouldn't put it quite that bluntly. This moral equivalence argument from later in his video is completely at odds with that idea, however. If you're trying to argue Western Europeans are supposedly a superior people, then that's what you have to prove. Moral superiority, not moral equivalence. But they did it too. Isn't a good enough argument, Stefan. Anyway, we're getting pretty close to wrapping up now, but before we do, I'd like to touch on a few more aspects of the genocide debate that Stefan doesn't mention in his video, and they relate to the following section of the UN's legal definition of genocide. And I quote, "Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Both these things can be classified as genocide." So first up, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So in the 1960s and 70s, the United States Indian Health Service sterilized thousands of Native American women, often without their consent and sometimes without even their knowledge. And well, that's all I have to say about that, really. It so perfectly fits the exact legal definition there that I don't really need to elaborate, I don't think. Yes, that really happened, and no, Stefan doesn't mention it. Next up is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Well, I won't dwell on this, but let's briefly talk about the Canadian Indian residential school system. So this was a system of boarding schools that Indigenous children were required to attend. The purpose of these schools was to, quote, "kill the Indian to save the man." A quote from a chap called Richard Henry Pratt there, who founded the first such boarding school. And these schools were notoriously harsh and brutal places to be. They were located far from reservations, so that the children would have little contact with their families or culture, and thus separated, the children were forced to speak another language, and the practice of native cultural activities was banned, with corporal punishment being used to enforce these rules. These schools, the purpose of which was obviously to eradicate native culture and replace it with the dominant culture, were operated into the 1980s, and several apologies have since been issued by the Canadian government on the matter. So, there we go, 2 examples there of acts that can be called genocidal, continuing into very recent times, only a few decades ago. Stefan doesn't consider these factors. Perhaps they don't meet his definition of genocide, but it's worthwhile asking here, what is Stefan's definition of genocide as presented in this video? He seems to think that the only acceptable definition of genocide is the total, unanimous, and unceasing attempt of one people to wipe out another people. And is that a reasonable definition? I'll leave that up to you to decide. So, we're back to arguing definitions of genocide again. And I suppose much of the debate depends upon whether you believe genocide describes the intent or the result. Of course, for the most part, the United States wanted territorial expansion, and it was willing to use genocide as both a threat and a practical weapon to achieve that goal. Stefan at one point mentions Thomas Jefferson's attempts to inoculate natives against disease, but even Jefferson, in other circumstances, was willing to threaten native people with genocide. In 1807 he wrote, "If ever we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, we will never lay it down till that tribe is exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi. In war they will kill some of us, we shall destroy all of them." So genocide was clearly on the table then, at least as a threat. And it's genocide as a means rather than an end, but is that still genocide? Well, personally, I've seen it argued that ethnic cleansing is a more generally appropriate term here, though I'd still argue that the history is peppered with, at the very least, genocidal moments, genocidal incidents, even if genocide wasn't continuous and unceasing government policy throughout the whole period. But regardless of how we classify it, and this is going all the way back to the start of the video here, Regardless of how we classify the actions of the invading European Americans, how they treated the Native Americans was for the most part completely unjustified, morally wrong, and only defensible if you, as Stefan does, completely ignore the majority of the actual history. I'd like to end today with a brief note about white guilt, that being what Stefan says is behind the attempts to distort the true history in which white people were always great. Lauren Southern has also used this excuse to explain some of the horrible stuff she believes. White people hate themselves and are so guilty about the sins of the past that they're ignoring reality and deluding themselves in the present. And, well, it's not true. Now, I'm not saying white guilt is impossible as a concept, just that people like Stefan and Lauren Southern aren't applying it correctly. Reading the history of what happened to the Native Americans, I was often outraged, sometimes disgusted, but I never felt personally guilty, just saddened by what people can do to one another. Acknowledging events from the past in which white people have been in the wrong isn't driven by guilt, just honesty. Understanding is not guilt. Hiding from the historical record, cherry-picking from it, whitewashing it to erase atrocities committed, well, that's real guilt in action right there. Thanks for watching, everyone. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and basically just have a grand old time interacting with YouTube right there. Thanks especially, as always, to my supporters on Patreon who enable me to keep making videos like this. We're closing in on our next goal, which is scary, so head over there and check it out if you feel like. I'm also thinking of doing another Q&A video for 25k subscribers, which should be coming up fairly soon. So if you want to ask a question, send it me over on Curious Cat, and make sure to sign a name at the bottom if you want a name read out, and put for your Q&A video at the top or something, so I know it's not just a regular question. Okay folks, thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.